Hey folks, this is Kalani. Let's have a little talk about what's happening to the World of Warcraft. So recently they lost 3 million subscribers, down from about 10 million to about 7 million, which is the largest dip WoW has ever seen, which is kind of shocking, kind of ridiculous, I'll be perfectly honest. To put it into some kind of perspective, they lost more than a quarter, almost a third of their player base. They lost more players than most games even have playing them. Which, you know, they basically lost a startup game worth of players. Which is, as I say, absolutely absurd. But it's not fully unexpected, and that's basically to do with what Warlords brought to the table, what Warlords is, and what it kind of did wrong. So the first thing is that those influx of players, a great deal of them might be new players, might be old players returning, who just didn't like what Warlords of Draenor was offering. So that kind of might account for a large chunk of them, and in that case, I'm not entirely sure what you could do to bring them back. But there are quite a few things almost wrong with World of Warcraft right now, but some of them are being blown way out of proportion, so let's have a look at some of the big ones. The one that I keep seeing, and I see it repeatedly everywhere, and it's really frustrating to see, is that people are saying World of Warcraft is too easy, and that's really, first, subjective, and second, hard to describe, because calling the game easy, or calling it easier than it was, is actually a loaded thing to say. It's not necessarily easier, but people are definitely a lot better at figuring out what they need to do. So, if you think back to vanilla, things weren't necessarily difficult. The most difficult things that you had were things that were very poorly tuned and things which were very unforgiving. An unforgiving mechanic or an unforgiving game does not equal a difficult game. It's not difficult to necessarily master, but as soon as you put one toe out of line, you die and everyone else dies. This is very, very common with a lot of vanilla raid mechanics where you have a big bomb. One person has this bomb. They need to move out of the raid. They move out of the raid, that's fantastic. If they don't, it blows everyone up and everyone dies. That one mechanic is so unforgiving to that player moving that if they do move, you're fine, and if you don't, they blow up. If, for instance, they blew up, didn't necessarily kill everybody, but found it difficult to move because they were slowed or something, you would then have a difficult mechanic. Not too difficult, obviously, but it's more difficult than move or not, compared to person moves away while group moves away to give them more room, or they need to do something to prepare for the damage coming if they can't quite get out in time, you know. So it's something which you can either prepare for and mitigate the damage of, which kind of stresses other parts of the fight, but isn't a clean death or survive. Like, that's the kind of difficulty that people seem to want, but that's not the difficulty that we necessarily had back then. So calling it easier than what it used to be isn't necessarily true, and you need to remember that people were kind of bad back then. They really were. People found it difficult to press 2 buttons. People found it difficult to maintain high DPS, which was very difficult to track back then anyway, and move at the same time. Things weren't always as fluid as they are now, so people can play much better than what they did, and I think that's to do with of what's available right now. If you think about it, back in the day, you didn't have all of these websites teaching you how to play your class. You didn't have all of these websites teaching you how to do every single encounter in a raid. You basically go to one of your websites, whichever you prefer, you find out how your class is playing right now, you figure out what buttons to press when, and then you basically get told how to defeat an encounter. It's not you going into a blank slate and smashing your head against it until something works. There was, back in the day, a lot of trial and error. There really was. You had one or two people who could come up with these brilliant strategies and everybody followed suit and everybody tried to make things work. Nowadays, you have hundreds, if not thousands of minds working together to essentially solve the same puzzle. And as soon as someone comes up with something, it gets pasted across everything else. So then everybody knows about that one method to downing this boss. Then as people farm it, things become more efficient, more thoughts get added to it, and by the time it even hits live servers, there's already guides for every raid encounter. I mean, you go in and you can research every single fight. When we go into Hellfire Citadel, you'll be able to research every single fight the first day that raid comes out, because it's been tested thoroughly, there's been 6.2 PTR testing done on it, and there's websites which are basically just for that kind of thing. They hold that information and they will give it to you free of charge. So everybody knows how to deal with the raid encounters. Back then, they didn't. So the amount of information which people have access to right now lets them basically play far ahead of their own actual work. If you had to theory craft your class yourself, if you had to go in with a fresh raid group, no idea what any of the bosses did in a raid encounter, and rely on one or two people to come up with the strategies, I guarantee you things would be a lot, quote unquote, harder than they are right now. So that kind of artificially lowers the difficulty of the game, but some parts really are way too easy. Like, leveling right now is kind of disgusting, to the point where somebody coming through 1 to 100 right now, leveling through that as a brand new player, is probably going to get one hell of a shock when they reach 100 and suddenly people expect them to do an actual decent amount of damage in dungeons, or people have been tanking 1 to 100 and not understanding what they're actually doing, and they can get to 100 without knowing any fundamentals of the game, which is potentially a problem with the separation of leveling and endgame, because they really have nothing in common. They don't cross over almost at all. So you could almost call it two different games there, and I think Blizzard focusing on the endgame so much that they kind of ignore a great deal of the leveling process, because for most people that's entirely secondary. That's a minor grind to get to the real game at the end game of any new expansion. So things kind of get put on the back seat there a great deal, I would think, which is frustrating to see, because this game has become all about the end game raiding. But what do you do if you don't raid? I guess you don't really do a great deal, which is why they introduce things like garrisons. But I mean, they have their own issues, which we'll get to in a little while. But if you couldn't raid, there's this brand new thing called looking for raid, and a lot of people are actually complaining about this as well, saying that looking for raid is ruining the game. It's destroying potential raiders, because they can go in, do LFR, do basically nothing, and get gear and see the bosses, quote unquote. But I'd feel things would be a lot better if you didn't treat looking for raid as raiding. It just isn't. There isn't enough difficulty there to compare it to even normal, and people are saying that they're raiding when they're actually not. So when they take that step up, or when they try to take that step up to normal, they find themselves in a really frustrating position for themselves and for the groups they're trying to join, because they don't learn anything in looking for raid. You can stand there auto-attacking a boss. Half the raid can be AFK, and the boss can still go down. It's not a stepping stone to real raiding, and I feel way too many people are trying to treat it as such. But I'm not entirely sure how you would fix that either. If you remove looking for raid right now, a huge percentage of the population playing World of Warcraft just wouldn't see some of the raids. They don't have the time, they don't have a decent enough schedule, they don't have the willpower, they don't even care about it necessarily, so they wouldn't see anything past looking for raid. But how do you incentivize going into normal raiding from there? How do you incentivize learning about your class, learning about these raids and what you actually need to do to be in a successful raid group for normal, heroic, and then pushing into mythic? Because mythic is having its own issues as well. Mythic 20-man is killing off a lot of guilds because people just can't maintain the 23, 24, 25 people roster that you need to run a successful mythic guild. People are saying that they should put it down to 10-man mythic, and I don't think that would work either. It's just, again, a really crappy situation to be in, because Mythic 20-man allows Blizzard to balance things. That's what they said from day one. It lets them balance things easier, everything is all super shiny, and they can basically make the fight what they want to make it, and then people can go and see it on lower difficulties if they really want to. But 20-man it's problematic. It really is. I've been in 2 guilds now which have fallen apart essentially because you can't get enough players to go into Mythic. And it's not just you can't get enough players, you need Mythic caliber players, which really doesn't help when you have the starting point being looking for raid. So people starting at looking for raid, if they go into normal and find that they can't hack normal, they're just going to stop that progression there. To get a Mythic caliber player, you need someone to go from a fresh new player, bear in mind. You need them to go through things like dungeons and looking for raid, and then into normal. They need to push through normal to do heroic, and then they need to be good enough to come from heroic and start doing things in Mythic. If they stop at normal because they can't hack normal, they're just not going to get into the Mythic pool of players, so these guilds have less and less players to pull from, which obviously doesn't help anyone. Now the real question is, can we have Mythic 10-man? Because apparently having both would be too much of an issue. So how many people would complain if we went down to a Mythic 10-man mode instead of 20-man mode? That would make it far more accessible for the people who want to stick with 10-man, but then I feel you have less room for mistakes, which might potentially affect how Mythic is balanced, making everything easier, furthering, the crying about WoW being far too easy. So that's something which is obviously a balancing game on Blizzard's side. If they want to stick with 20-man, there isn't really a great deal we can do about it. Which, if it's for better, fantastic. If it's for worse, bloody hell, that's going to be crap. But I feel if they lowered it a little bit, it could be potentially quite interesting. Because if you think about things now, you need 2 tanks for 20 players in Mythic. If you had a 10-player Mythic setting, you would have 2 players tanking for 10 players, meaning that in every 20 players you would actually have double the tanks, making every queue before raiding potentially shorter, because people typically wait on tanks and healers. Healers would see probably about the same, because at the moment it's 2 or 3 for 10-man and then 4 to 6 for 20-man. I mean, probably 4 to 5 for 20-man, so there may be a slight increase in healers there, but either way, I feel that would balance the tank-healer DPS ratio a little better, because if anybody's been tanking trying to find a guild, they know it's probably one of the hardest spots to get into, because tanks are, well, first and foremost, they're required, absolutely unequivocally required for you to raid, so those 2 spots always have to be filled, and quite typically they almost always are filled. So getting a tanking spot is actually really difficult, simply because you only need 2 tanks for a 20-man raid, which, is something which could potentially help. So that's what's happening on the raiding side of things, but there's actually quite a few issues that people bring up outside of raiding, which is kind of dangerous in and of itself, because raiding is supposed to be one of the big things about the game. But never mind, we also have people saying that the world just doesn't feel alive anymore. There's no community spirit anymore, which I'd have to agree with. People don't really seem to give a damn about their fellow players anymore, which is really sad to see. It's trying to start a conversation in a random dungeon and nobody replies. Nobody says anything at all. You might as well be playing a single player game, or, just play with bots. I mean, some of them probably were bots before the bot bans, but never mind. Either way, I think that's one part of World of Warcraft which is severely lacking and really hurting at the moment. But how do you fix that? Because a lot of the issues seem to come from us. We want things to be efficient, we want things to be nice and easy. We sign up for a dungeon, we get into a random group, we do the dungeon, we'll probably never see any of those people again. There's no community bonds being formed, there's no ties there, because, they're probably not even on the same server as you. If they are, you're still probably never going to see them again. So, A, that means there's nothing stopping you from being a complete tool and just trolling everybody in there. And then B, obviously, if no one's chatting to each other, no one's forming these friendships, there's just no community to speak of. So, how do you help the community start thriving again when to do it you would have to hurt quality of life and hurt efficiency? Like, if you took out the looking for dungeon tool, people would have to form their own groups again. It would take a lot longer. That hurts efficiency. The reason that was introduced was because it took a long time to find a tank on your server, for example, and you can't really start advertising cross-server because you couldn't in trade. I do wonder, however, if they took out the looking for dungeon tool and instead just kept the looking for group tool that they have now, you know, the one people use to form normal and heroic flex raids, I wonder if that would be a nicer system, because you would be able to pick and choose who you'd want in your dungeon groups, potentially limiting the amount of trolls. It would also allow you to kick people and have a nice pool of players to draw from whenever you wanted to, so you get to choose who was going with you. You'd have to run to the dungeon because you wouldn't be able to port in, meaning that's more people out in the world. Again, it does hurt efficiency because that's time you have to wait, but whatever. And it's more building it yourself instead of it being built for you. I don't know, that could be an interesting take on things, but I don't really think they'd remove the looking for dungeon tool at this time. It seems to be well integrated into what World of Warcraft is supposed to be. But either way, the community side of things is quite lacking, and I don't really think there's a way to fix that without hurting the efficiency and the quality of life improvements that we've come to get used to, that we use every day. So that's a tricky one. I'm not entirely sure what could be done there, unless all of these people will be happy to give up their looking for dungeon tool, and I'm pretty sure quite a few people would not be. I mean, that extends somewhat into looking for aid as well. I don't want to dwell too much, but looking for aid, people tend to be a little bit of a troll, a little bit of a tool, a little bit of a douchebag, because they can be. There's no consequences for it, which, obviously, if everything was server-based, then people get to know who the trolls were. They wouldn't get invited anymore, so people actually behave themselves a little better. But, I don't know. I've seen people chatting a lot and looking for aid, so maybe it's a little bit better, but it's still a far cry from what I'd actually want on a server. But never mind, the community is a little lacking, I would say. Now, we touched on garrisons a little bit, and I want to expand on that, because garrisons, I feel, were kind of a failure. They were fun at the beginning, they were new, they were interesting, and they got very stale very quickly. The missions didn't really offer a great deal of variety, and you never even got to go on any of them anyway. So it felt very much like you were almost detached from your garrison. You didn't really have anything personal to do with it. If you could go on the missions with your followers, that would be amazing. If you could take your followers and assault an additional garrison, that would be amazing. Can you imagine PvP between a Horde and Alliance garrison relying on your followers to beat each other up? That'd be brilliant. But then you also have no risk whatsoever with your followers, like, at all. If a follower fails a mission, oh well, tough luck. I mean, they even still get experience, but tough luck, you didn't get whatever the bonus item is from the mission. Oh no. What if they had followers who could get injured? What if you had to choose whether you replace followers or spend a building slot to help heal followers, and sending them on these risky missions would actually have some risk-reward factor in that you could lose followers trying to get a shiny reward. But I don't know, it seems as though people don't really care for that kind of thing because they don't like anything risky. People don't want to lose their followers because it means extra work. Like, people seem to already be complaining about the 6.2 naval missions where you can lose your ships because, oh no, what if I build up this amazing ship and give it really expensive equipment and then it just gets destroyed? I've lost so much work. Yes, so don't send it on risky missions if you don't want to lose your ship. If you want high reward, there should be some form of risk involved, especially something as detached as garrison missions. But I don't know, garrisons could have been so fantastic. What if the garrison system was like Clash of Clans, where you build up your garrison, you get all these shiny resources? Hell, it even could have been just like a Warcraft 3 campaign mission where you build up your base, everything's super shiny, you get all your troops or followers, and then you take them out personally and deal with something. Deal with these threats. Get rewards for things. Assault these garrisons. I don't know. I guess that's too many resources to put into garrisons, and apparently this expansion is only a filler expansion anyway, which is probably the most ridiculous thing I have ever heard. This expansion, I don't even know if you could call it an expansion at this point, but it cost more money in every region and is potentially only going to last a year with 2 tiers of raiding. The patches we've had so far have been lackluster. 6.2 looks okay, but I'm wondering how long it'll keep people interested, or if it'll even bring people back. That's dangerous, and it's even more dangerous to call it a filler expansion, because people suddenly think, oh, so we paid extra for a lesser expansion, so you can work on the next expansion, charge us for an expansion again, all the while we're paying for a subscription fee. That's dangerous, because people are going to start saying these things, and the more people that say these things, the more people are going to believe it. Which is the power of people, really, the power of word of mouth, but it can be very dangerous when it's a negative thing. So I think they need to tread very carefully with how they handle the end of this expansion going into the next one, because that seems to be their plan. And I'd say if Blizzard did anything wrong recently, it was to almost neglect Warlords of Draenor so they could get the next expansion out faster. Yes, we want content faster, but we don't necessarily want an expansion every year, because that's an additional $60 every year at this point, while paying $15 every month to keep playing. I don't know. That's probably the biggest gripe I have right now. If we have to throw down another chunk of cash on an expansion, which, you know, if it's going to be the same as Warlords of Draenor, a lot of people might not return. They might not get that huge mountain of subscribers that they got. The 10 million people that were playing at the start of Warlords of Draenor, that was nearly 3 million increase from the end of Mists of Pandaria. They came back to see what WoW could be at its roots. And obviously they were disappointed. Thoroughly so, apparently. But either way, if we get another expansion, hopefully they do everything right this time. I'm kind of wondering what they're going to change, because Mythic 20-man seems to be a key issue which they don't seem all too thrilled to change, and garrisons, while they started amazingly, seem to have teetered off quite considerably. So I'm wondering what we'll see for the next expansion, because at this point that's almost all I'm really excited for. Hellfire Citadel raid, then next expansion. And hopefully they'll do better this time. But that's my thoughts on what's happening with WoW currently, why we just lost so many players, and what's going to be the future of WoW. I wouldn't necessarily say WoW is dying. I mean, it lost a huge chunk of subs, but it's still got more active paying subscribers than any other subscription MMO to date. Meaning that it's probably not going to go anywhere, but if they don't shape up, they might see that number drop another 3 million. So we'll have to see what happens. I hope it doesn't. I love this game and I hope only good things for it. Just can't help be frustrated right now. So that's my thoughts. Have any questions? Leave them in the comment section below. Remember to leave a like just below the video before you leave. And if you want to see more, make sure to subscribe. But apart from that, thanks for watching, folks. Good luck and have fun. And as always,